Mine too.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today for the second workshop in the Tenant Training 101 series. I'm Chelsea Kamen. I'm with the Maryland Department of Disabilities, and we have some great panelists today who are going to be going through our one of our manuals that is extremely helpful for conducting a tenant training with somebody one-on-one. Just a bit of housekeeping to go through. We are going to be taking, we'll have Lisa Waddell monitoring the Q&A in the chat. So make sure that if you have a question during the presentation, that you're putting that in the Q&A. And the chat, if you have technical issues or questions or things that come up related to just the webinar itself, you can put those in the chat. I will go ahead and share my screen so you all can see the presentation now. And we're going to get started with Penny Scrivens. She's with the Maryland Department of Disabilities, and many of you might already know her. She does tenant training for our programs and has extensive experience working in the behavioral health field. So I will go ahead and let Penny take it away. Penny?
All right. I said I'm just not the best at computers. So are you going to move the slides along to Chelsea or no?
Yes, I will.
Okay, go ahead. You can move it along. I think we're going to start with a poll question, because for me, when I sat down to actually revise the slides I had, I was just wondering whether anyone in the audience participating today had a copy of My Own Front Door. And if you could let us know yes or no. And then to let me know if you've ever used the handbook with a client before.
So just to let you know, I did launch the poll and people are responding. It looks like we have had a lot of people indicating that they do not have a copy of the handbook. And a lot of people also indicating that they've never used it with their clients. So we have about 75% said no for the first question and 82% for the second question. So I'll go ahead and end the poll now.
Okay, well, down in the green, I put down on the polling question, the website for mdod.maryland.gov, where you can download the handbook and also the case management training guide that Chelsea spoke about in her presentation over a week ago. Okay, next slide. This is the front copy of the My Own Front Door. And if you want to go back, I just want to mention, I believe I have this correct, the townhouses that seem to be, they're not duplexes, but they're townhouses. This actually is one of our first properties. It was in Cambridge. And I just want to let you know that there was one that was a no-step entry, and then the one next to it was housing for a family, and they moved in with their 2 children. It was a single mom, and she had not lived with her children for a while, so she was able to get everybody back into one spot, and she really loved it. This was a big transplant for her in terms of coming from one side of the shore to from Prince George's County over to the Eastern Shore. So I just want to let you know this didn't come from the architect booklets that you might see. This is really one of our, first properties. Okay, next slide. I just want to remind people why we are putting this together. It's to assist people with disabilities, their families, case managers like yourself. And we want them to be able to, along with their team or their family, to be able to conduct an informed housing search. and know what is expected of them and what they can expect from the people that are working with them. I went back to the table of contents, and it really starts with learning, thinking about moving, planning, learning what's out there as far as subsidies. Can I live independently? We have websites for searching, identifying preferences and needs, referral, readiness, readiness to live independently. That's another thing that you might need to dig a little bit deeper when you're talking with your client about whether they're ready for this. Also, the leasing process, which Marianne and Lisa are going to talk about later, and maintaining your tenancy. And that's a big topic. Lots of times when people move in, they get moved in, and then some issues kind of come up that, maybe you hadn't planned for. And then, of course, leaving the unit. So I just want to let you know that sometimes when you're doing tenant training, you're already working with somebody that's moved in already. So some of the booklet, at least in the beginning, the first, I guess, 15 pages or so, might have to do with whether you were involved with the assessing their readiness, going over the preferences and the needs of that particular person, and if they lived on their own or with an aide. And then what it's going to take to get them ready to make that big step, because it is a big one for people. And then the tenant training offers you an opportunity as a case manager and people that are working with this person and their family to engage and talk and kind of solve problems before they even begin, because there may be concerns that are not in our handbook that come up as person is getting ready to move from where they're at, whether it be a facility, their uncle's couch, because we do serve people that are homeless or in danger of being homeless, and then a lot of people in between there. Next slide. Another polling
Looks like we may have lost Penny, so unfortunately. So we have a polling question here, and I'm trying to launch the poll, but I am getting some technical difficulties from Zoom. So what I'd like for you guys to do is, if you could indicate in the chat your response to this question. How many times have you moved as an adult, and how many times have you had to sign a lease? Just curious to see what responses we get. And Lisa, if you wanted to call out some of the responses you're seeing in the chat, that'd be awesome.
Okay. So one person said they've moved twice and have never signed a lease, but has helped clients sign a lease multiple times. Someone has moved 3 times and signed a lease 3 times. And Rebecca stated she moved once as an adult. Is Penny?
I'm back.
Great. I was having some issues with the actual polling, so I'm having people give us responses in the chat. And Lisa's just kind of.
Okay.
And Russell
we've
has
had-
moved 6 times and signed at least 3 times.
Okay, so we've had people having some experiences moving out as an adult, and it could have been when you were moving from your family home to going to your first year of college, or after you got your first job. You might have moved in with a roommate, and then all those other circumstances that kind of lead us to, you know, more independent living and taking responsibilities for leasing and turning on utilities. Okay, let's move on from that. Good to know. The other, I mentioned about readiness and eligibility for subsidy. I mean, that is something that the case manager is going to be involved in as the person is getting ready to be thinking about it, getting their families up to speed on what that means, especially if someone's coming out of a facility and there's some mixed concerns. Sometimes family does not think it's a great idea to move on, and the identified client, future tenant, actually feels like they can do it and needs an opportunity to be able to prove that to other people, including their family and of course themselves. You're going to be assessing their income, whether they can pay rent, utilities, and looking at the reason why they might be moving from their current living situation. Sometimes if you are dealing with a level of care in a facility, it could be that they do not meet the criteria anymore for that. And so there's a need actually to move on from where they have even got rehab. I know I've met several people that have gotten tenant training from me that had moved out of a rehab facility, and they were really having some difficulty, but trying to work through some of the changes that they've had to cope with in terms of moving to a new place. You also want to know what those needs are. If they're physical needs, that they don't need stairs or can't do stairs, open living spaces. They are dependent upon transportation. If they need someone to help them with their ADLs and so forth. The handbook actually has, if they're not wedded to a program, but you're helping them actually move on from where they currently are, and it could be a facility, it could be homelessness, or moving from a residential program. We have some websites that are located in the booklet where there might be possible vacancies. Sometimes you're working with the state and/or local housing authority or housing agencies or nonprofits that provide housing subsidies. That's what I meant by the service provider. So it could be that you're working with them to actually get the person into another housing situation. Okay. All right. The other thing is there's different, of course, criteria and eligibility for some of the programs. It could be an age issue. It could be a disability issue. It could be that the person does need to have a live-in aid. So we run the gamut of that all the way to being able to be very self-sufficient in their own apartment. And then the other thing it emphasizes with the table of contents, and you know, it's going to be variable. Sometimes you might be looking at getting documentation on one particular week, at another time you're actually doing a referral, or another time you're meeting with the family so that you can discuss, you know, what the issues or the items are that they're going to be needing in order to make that transition. And this might not be what you talk about in your tenant training, but it could be that that conversation may have happened with you or somebody that's helping you actually get this person in, and then you're going to be coming in to do the community resource development possibly, or just like in my case, I'm not the case manager when I go in, but I am the person that's opening up the information in the handbook that might be very helpful for them once they get moved in and get oriented to their new surroundings. Next slide. This is just housing preferences. Again, this is something that probably needs to be discussed with the case manager that's working with getting the person referred to a program. But you could also see what the person might need after they do move in, and had an expectation that something was going to be there, like a handrail in the bathroom, and it's not there, and they are, you know, very tenuous about taking a shower or even getting into the bathtub and being not able to get out. And that has happened. So, you know, those kind of modifications can be a carryover from when that was assessed and the need was assessed and they decided, yeah, I'm going to need this, but then, you know, when they get into the unit, it's not available. And sometimes we can work those things out before the person actually moves in. And I know we've done that in the past. It's not always 100%, but there could be some ways to actually get that taken care of, especially when it's known that that's something that the person's going to need. But knowing that they may want an emotional support animal, finding out what the policy is before they move in, at least they have, you know, an expectation that they can or cannot utilize that particular reasonable accommodation. And in most cases, if it's an emotional support animal that you're requesting for that person, or they've told you that that's one of the things that they need to have, that process can be started, you know, right from the very beginning. And there's, I don't think that we've ever had really any objection to that, because it's something that okay, next slide. Okay. This is a list of documents that may or may not be something that you're going to go over again in your tenant training, but making sure that the person kind of keeps track of those items, because they're going to need them for their recertification. They may need them actually to be able to activate their community MA, especially if they came out of a facility and had been getting long-term MA. Having an idea about their credit score, which is done before during the leasing process. They'll do a background check. and knowing if there's something that they need to get expunged from any of that. So that might have taken place before they actually got approved to move in. But having a handle on where to go and where to get updated information. And it's, you know, it's good to kind of go over that with them so that they can periodically check on their own. One of the things that's going on right now, which I've helped a couple people with actually, is the Maryland ID, check the expiration dates. And I believe now that they have until May of 2023 to be able to get a new and current ID in Maryland. Birth certificate, those kinds of things should have been done before you even start your maybe one-time only tenant training. I don't know if everyone in the audience is going to be following up with their clients. Sometimes they do. Sometimes someone else in the community is going to be taking hold of that as far as getting them set up with resources in the area that they've moved at. But it's, like I said, it's good to emphasize that they need to keep track of their paperwork, maybe have a separate place where they keep all of their important paperwork, because they will need it for their yearly recertification. Okay, next slide. Budget, that's going to be adjusted, you know, knowing what income is coming in. And they give a list in the booklet of things that the person probably reviewed with the case manager or the referral source, actually, to just make sure that they fit the criteria for the unit or the subsidy that they applied for. So we're going to look at, you know, whether they get SSI, SSDI, and how their expenses match up to their budget, and where they're going to find that there might be some issues. But this is the list of things that's suggested in the handbook. Next slide. The other thing sometimes is they forget about some of the move-in expenses. And if you've had the experience yourself of moving in, it's the little trash cans, it's the towels, it's things that usually are taken care of, especially if you came from a facility. And they're not things that you might think right away unless you've kind of made a list of what those expenses might be. So the one that's, you know, the budget that's going to be more the norm is going to be just your monthly expenses, which you can estimate, and they ask you to do that in several ways. We have charts that are located in the handbook itself, and we also have latched on to the Consumer Financial Protection Agency or Bureau. They have lots of tools, webinars. They have technical assistance folks that can kind of help. And the next slide, Chelsea. This is some of the booklets that I know I have used with consumers and also tenants. They're very, as you can see, they're very colorful. They're, if you open them up, actually, they have very readable charts, ones that can be Xerox and duplicated, things that people can put in their phone as far as putting estimates together, because you do have to kind of play with your budget a little bit. Because sometimes people just think there's no way that I can manage this. And then they find that there's some things that they're not going to need to pay for, and or those expenses might kind of taper off after the first couple of months. And then, like I said, the more of a workable budget is what comes into place after people get through that beginning and move in phase. Okay, next slide. Just wanted you to see what they look like. I'm using Chelsea's slide from a week ago, but again, to emphasize the toolkits, the booklets, there's companion guides. They also offer training and also webinars for persons that are working with persons that are disabled. So case managers actually have you know, a whole set of tools that they can use with the folks that they work with. There's reentry, people that are coming out of jails or other correction facilities. And I believe that they're continuing to work on toolkits that work with other populations as well. I think actually Native American populations, actually, that's another category that they picked up. Next slide. I just want you to note at the bottom, I'm sorry, that website that you can get that. Again, Lisa and Marianne are going to talk a little bit about certainly the leasing process, but also what tenants are going to be paying. That's in the handbook as well. There may be some more questions about that. I know that Chelsea did a very extensive and detailed explanation of the project base, tenant base. There's different rules and privileges. The subsidy is paid, you know, either by DHCD or by the housing authority, or, you know, because there's different subsidies out there. There's some that are federal and some that are local. Next slide. Again, I'm using this. I think it's a very plain, very simple approach to explaining how the rent and the utility allowance come together to make, in this case, example, we use Grace, and this is her monthly income. Her 30% of the income is $235. Her utility allowance is $75. And then on the agreement that they get, there's a letter that our folks that are getting the HUD 811 subsidy, they'll get a breakdown of the utility allowance and the monthly rent. So, and that should never be over that 30% guideline, okay? It does do, again, Chelsea had this slide, but we've used it with other, you know, webinars that we've done just to kind of plainly have something that somebody can take, whether a tenant or the payee, it could be a payee or a guardian that's paying the rent. But knowing for the tenant, actually, they may have someone that's doing that bill paying for them. But to understand that there's going to be two bills, one is the rent, the other is they're going to have to be paying the utility bill. Okay, next slide. There is another section in the handbook, and I think it's not always well used. It could be that it's used in a different way when the person is having an assessment or before they even decide they're going to be moving in. But it has to do with that readiness for housing, what they're going to need to do in terms of their budget, living independently, what's that going to take. But in there, there's charts actually that you can check off. And this is for someone that's working with that particular person before tenant training even begins. I mean, this is just in those beginning phases of what accessibility is going to mean for that particular tenant or future tenant, and whether they need a ramp or a wheelchair ramp, or if they need a special accommodation in the unit. And that could be anything sometimes, because sometimes you're not aware of what you're going to need till you actually see what the unit looks like. Again, it could be as simple as the handrails in the bathroom. And I don't think we utilize those checkoff charts, but it could be something to kind of take a look at even during that process of tenant training, to just make sure some of those basic needs and the list that they may have developed, several months or even a year ago, whether that's changed or not. And I just listed some, just a few of the things that are pretty common when the unit is inspected. You're gonna, if the person is able to, and I know sometimes they haven't been able to go through the unit and inspect it. And this is, of course, after they've moved, getting ready to lease up, to see whether there is a way for them to utilize fully the kitchen, the bathroom. Can they clean the unit? And is the bedroom big enough for either equipment or for the person to be able to walk around in the bedroom, to be able to get to the closet and dress themselves, and if they need a chair in the bedroom to sit down on, to put their shoes and socks on. Because sometimes they can be pretty small, especially if they put a big bed in there, and there's not a lot of room for those other things that they might need during the day. Okay. Next slide. Yeah. In the handbook, we also give you some other subsidy programs that we're aware of. And that, like I said, there are possibly other ones, but I think most everybody that's in this particular webinar is going to be working with folks that are either in Weinberg or Bridge, or of course the HUD 811. But in some other programs, if you are able to work with people that, like a nonprofit that actually has a subsidy and promotes independent living, they may have other particular documentation or a process that's a little bit different than ours. So just finding out about that, and if that is something that you can accommodate as well. In the tenant training manual, there is information about where to seek out questions about housing discrimination, laws about emotional support animals, how to write up requests for one. And I'm going to show you a couple of letters, or sample letters actually, indicating that their needs, they would like to have a consideration of a reasonable accommodation. And that might be something that you would discuss maybe in that first time, if you're meeting the person for the first time in that tenant training, because they've already moved in and they can see that there's a need to have certain things either rearranged or put in, or taken care of pretty soon after they move in, because the need is immediate almost, but they hadn't anticipated that. I put down that in that reasonable accommodation request, there's no need to put in a diagnosis, medication, doctor's names, any other things that align with disclosure of their disability. It's really just about the accommodation that they are requesting. Next slide. This is a list we put together. I know in the page that has this information on, we've had to take a couple of these resources out because they either have merged with another agency, or they are no longer doing what they had started out to do. One is the Baltimore Neighborhoods Commission, I believe. They used to do webinars in Baltimore City, but they have morphed into something else. But, and these are, of course, it's not an exhaustive list of agencies, but certainly ones that we usually go to get some of our questions, us meaning at MDOD, to make sure that we are supporting as well as giving the correct information, or at least giving the person or the family or even the case manager the correct resource so that they can follow up. Okay. I think that's the next slide. Persons with disabilities have a right to reasonable accommodations, and they requested through their property owners or property manager to change certain rules, policies, physical characteristics of a unit, or services to provide an equal opportunity for the tenant to live and enjoy their new unit. Again, most times I think they are, you know, doable, and they're within, you know, the tenant's right to be able to ask for these accommodations. Decisions have been appealed. We've gone through that with some of the clients. I know Christina and Chelsea can attest to that as well. But this might be the time that you doing the tenant training are hearing for the very first time, or maybe even the case manager is hearing for the very first time if they are part of the tenant training process as well. That they're hearing that they need to follow up with something pretty soon after the person moves in. And it hadn't been possibly anticipated, but maybe sooner than later for something needs to be taken care of. So this is a good time to kind of take a look at the two samples that I have. Next two slides, Chelsea. This is the one that you can download from HUD. I can't read all of the fine print, but it definitely gives you a good example actually of what to put into a letter that's requesting a reasonable accommodation. And then the next one, and you can download this from the HUD website. You just put in reasonable accommodation sample letter to HUD and it'll pop right up. Next one. This is another letter. And again, you don't see a lot of emphasis in there about the disability or any details about their treatment or what kind of follow-up they're going to get while they're living in the unit. It just has to do with the need for that a reasonable accommodation to be able to support themselves getting in and out of the tub or the shower, or railings around the toilet, so they can get up and down from the seat. So sometimes reasonable accommodations have been made because the unit is already ready for someone that needs the lower counters, the lower light switches, and other accommodations that are available in the ADA units. The other thing is you might want to have the case manager, if you're not doing it yourself, but if you're hearing for the first time, there needs to be a consideration for a reasonable accommodation. The actual property manager might have a form already in place that can be utilized as well. So they can ask about that because they know that this might be something that happens on a regular basis, whether it's a move-in or even while the person has lived there for a certain period of time and things have evolved for that person and they needing some assistance in the unit with a grab bar or something like that. All right, next one. Marianne and Lisa, I'm gonna give them the platform in a couple of minutes here, but they are gonna go through the lease. One of the things I like to say to people is there's no wrong questions. If you have a question, it's important to you and you want the answer so that you're hearing it, you understand it, and that's for the tenant as well. So they may be asking you things that you may or may not be able to give them the correct answer or at least the resource. And that might be something to get back to the case manager about, or if you're connecting with the case manager or linking them up in that particular location, let them know that these are going to be some of the issues, possibly getting renter's insurance or the accommodation for an emotional support animal. Answering questions like, my adult son needs to move in for a couple months. Do you think I can do that? Because I told him maybe if I got a unit that they could move in, and certainly that's not allowed. It's it's a violation of the lease. But having a discussion about it may relieve the new tenant of that responsibility in terms of having some backup with jeopardizing her lease or his lease, and if they let people that aren't on the lease move in and stay there certainly an extended period of time. But these are things sometimes that there's they think maybe since it's their place, they can do things that would be certainly a blatant violation of their lease. But sometimes they need to kind of ask those questions and certainly encourage that. The other thing is sustaining their tenancy. What is it going to take for that person to be able to stay there that whole year and beyond? And if you have the case manager that's going to continue working with that person, those questions might need to be brought up as well, if there is any at the moment. Sometimes they're just really just dealing with the move in and just figuring out how to get transportation to that area or getting food for the next week or so. Knowing how to handle emergencies and issues that come up, and knowing what the procedures are for actually accessing that assistance from the maintenance office. We're going to talk a little bit more in the lease about what's the definition of an emergency, a true emergency, and what's more of a maintenance issue, because we've had issues with that as well after people have moved in. Next slide. Poll. This one has to do with something I did slightly bring up about the adult son moving in, but the tenant does not have to pay their rent if hospitalized or in rehab for 30 days or more. Is that true or false? And then since the tenant is away for more than 30 days, subletting to a friend is allowed as a special situation.
So because I'm having issues with launching the polls, could you please indicate your response to this question in the chat? Thank you.
Okay, I think it's almost 100%. Yep. Everybody is false. That's absolutely, well, that's true. It's true that it's false on both questions. They do have to pay if they're in rehab or certainly have an extended absence from their unit, because they might go back to that unit in many situations. I have had, I don't know if anybody's experienced this or not, but somebody that moved into a city property, and I found out that their plan was to get into a safe and, excuse me, a supportive location where they could get their medical needs taken care of as well in the city. But he had planned for surgery, was waiting until he got moved in and got situated. And then he has been away from his unit for probably 2 or 3 weeks. But they did let the property management know that they were not going to be there because he was going to not only have the procedure, but he would have to be in rehab for a little bit. You know, he tried to think through what would happen if he didn't have a place versus having a place and maybe getting additional care when he moved into, after he moved into his own apartment and was able to connect with the community resources that he needed. So the property management does need to know if they're going to be away from the unit for more than, you know, a couple weeks or even a month or two. Next slide. Again, this is just a quick slide of what might be in the lease. Marianne and Lisa are going to go through those things, but definitely the responsibilities of the tenant and the owner, very important. Conditions for termination, knowing what those are. The do's and don'ts are likely to be something that you want to go over in that lease, especially in terms of having guests. They're responsible for the guests. They are responsible for maintaining the unit, for reporting any damages, and also to keep their trash in the proper bins. Sometimes people have had things delivered. This is one situation that's come up in a property that was in the Damascus area where things were being delivered by FedEx or Amazon, and there wasn't anyone to help a tenant who has a physical disability and not able to break down the boxes and take them down to the recycling bin. And we needed to, she needed to talk to somebody about having that done because she could not physically handle that. But I think when she reached out, there were definitely some people that offered their assistance, because it wasn't all the time, but they would accumulate outside in the hallway, which is, you know, not safe for anybody. And it's certainly a violation of, you know, their lease and picking up for them, you know, picking up their own trash and recycling as well, and disposing of it in the proper places. Next. There is in the handbook some websites for moving in, local and county services that might be able to help. Sometimes places I've found that you can get furniture or used furniture. Sometimes they already have people that do move these items from their location where they store things to the person's home. It may be a fee, it may be something that you could work out the fee if there's not a lot of upfront money to be able to handle those things. I'm sure that many of the case managers I've found actually know people or know of companies that do assist with this kind of move. It's not something that happens on a regular basis, of course, but if there is a need for the move-in services, we can try and accommodate that, before they move in, knowing that that's a need actually. The last section actually deals with ending your tenancy there. It's not that you just drop the keys off and leave. It's making sure that you have that final inspection. You want to get your security deposit back. And if you're going to stay another year, that there is that recertification process to renew their lease. Usually, most property managers start that process maybe 30 to 60 days ahead of that end of year date, just so you have time to get your paperwork together and set an appointment time or drop off the information so that they can get it taken care of and earlier than later. Next slide. This is my last one, but the other thing is one of the things I've found actually is definitely encourage the tenant and or the property and or the case manager to work with the property manager to build up a relationship with them. I mean, they don't have to be best friends, but it's good to have the tenant engage and have a relationship with the property manager, because you nor their case manager or family are going to be there 24/7. And there may be things that come up that have to be addressed immediately, or checking on something, asking a question, and they should feel comfortable being able to either call or go into the office, even if it's just to resolve, a problem with the mail or getting another copy of their lease. I know sometimes people lose their community rules for the property, or they don't know where they put them, but they need to look at them. These particular things they can handle without somebody speaking for them or going over and intervening, because we want a way for them to actually resolve some of those smaller issues without the case manager if need be. And thank you for excusing my computer problems in the beginning. Thanks, Chelsea, as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Marianne and Lisa.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Chelsea. So I'm Marianne Graham, and I am with the Maryland Department of Health and the Money Follows a Person demonstration project. And Lisa Waddell is also with us, and she is our housing specialist. And Lisa has been monitoring and will continue to monitor the chat and the Q&A while we go through our slides about the lease. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a lease? Obviously, a lot of you have experience, given your answers to the previous poll question, with signing leases. So you probably already know it's a legally binding document between the tenant and the landlord, which defines the tenant's rights and responsibilities, including the amount of rent, what utilities a tenant has to pay, and various other things, because as you all know, leases can be quite long. It defines the landlord's rights and responsibilities and what circumstances in which the lease can be broken. And definitely, this doesn't happen as much as it should, but tenants should read the lease before signing. If you're with a good property manager or a landlord, they will go over the lease with the tenant as they're going through it, but hopefully they'll give enough time for the tenant to really absorb what they're reading. Leases are not necessarily easy to read because sometimes they can be quite formal language. So if you're working with a client and you can be at the lease signing, we encourage that because that can be helpful to them and helping to interpret in case there is language that maybe they don't quite understand. Next slide. Okay, so this is the poll, kind of similar to what we've done before. And I think Chelsea is probably still having problems with the polling. So if you could answer in the chat. How old were you when you signed your first lease? Between answer A, between 18 and 25, answer B, 26 to 35, answer C, 36 to 45, or D, 46 and over. Opportunity to respond. I'm seeing a lot of A's. Somebody that never signed a lease. Okay. A B. Okay. Great. And as you may imagine, if you have if you're working with clients and they are in category D, where they looks like the poll is actually working. So if you could take a moment to actually respond to the actual poll, that would be great, because then we can get a percentage. Okay. So it's important to obtain a copy of the lease. The tenant should be given a copy of the lease at the lease signing. And then I would really encourage you as a support planner or case manager to get a copy of the lease, usually for the tenant. But if you're able to go to the lease signing, sometimes you can request one right then, and then that way you have a copy of it. And the purpose of that is in case a tenant loses their copy. I know, having been a case manager previously, that tenants do sometimes lose their copies of their lease. And if you have a copy of it, that can be handy, because sometimes there's situations where they might need to access it. If there's a dispute that you need to assist in resolving as a case manager or supports planner, then having a copy of the lease is helpful, because you'll know what is in it and what the rules and regulations are related to that particular tenant and their living situation. And then just to have it as a part of your client record, so that you just what their living situation is. Next slide. Okay. And then you want to make sure that the tenant have the correct lease. So in the HUD 811 Project Rental Assistance Program, there's a specific lease separate from any lease that the property may use for other tenants. As you may know, with HUD 811, there are units within larger properties. So there are definitely, could be multiple, anything from people paying market rate for a unit to people using Section 8 or the Housing Choice Voucher, people in the HUD 811 project, people in Weinberg. So it's important to know that, what lease your particular client is supposed to have. So if they're in HUD 811, they need a HUD 811 lease. And that lease supersedes the property's lease and is the lease that's enforceable. And the HUD 811 lease contains an addendum, which allows the tenant to have up to 180 days absence if it's due to medical reasons, as long as they continue to pay their rent and utilities during that period of time. Next slide. So the unit needs to be inspected prior to move-in. Usually this happens if possible, if everything is taking place in person, which sometimes with some of our clients, that's not actually possible. But if they're signing the lease at the property where the unit is, then usually what happens is they have an opportunity to go and inspect the unit prior to moving in right after usually it's like right after they've signed the lease. But the tenant can check for damages, they can check for items that may need to be fixed or replaced, and they can check out things like their outlets, water pressure, make sure the appliances are working properly. And the landlord property manager usually provides a checklist that they can go through to mark if there's any changes, and they usually ask the tenant to sign that after inspecting the unit. And then the lease should talk about how long the tenant has to request repairs. But that's important, because if they can get everything fixed before they actually move in, or if they can note any damages prior to them moving their items in, that's really good, because then they have a record of the fact that, oh, this thing wasn't working prior to me moving in. Next slide. So the lease, the signed lease, the effective date of the lease is when it is signed. So once the tenant signs the lease and dates it, they are in possession of that unit. They should receive the keys, and they can start moving in. The tenant needs to know the amount of their rent and when it is due, which that's also spelled out in the lease. And if, for example, somebody's moving from an institution like a nursing facility or a state residential center, their income may be reduced because the majority of their income may have been going to that facility. So, reinstating their income can be a process, but when they start receiving their full income, then that needs to be reported immediately. And if there's an increase in their income above $200 a month, it should be reported immediately as well. And at the same time, decreases in income in any amount should be reported, because it may make an impact on the amount of rent they're paying. So if someone is working and they lose their job, or if someone is receiving Social Security, Disability, or SSI, and maybe they have to do a payback where some of their income is being taken to pay back amounts for whatever reason through the Social Security Administration, then that should be reported, because it could be that their rent would be reduced, which would be helpful to them while they're having to make these payments. Next slide. So paying rent, it's good to have a discussion with your client about them having a plan for paying rent on time. In HUD 11 project rental assistance, there's no fees assessed for late rent payments. However, in other programs like Section 8, the Housing Choice Voucher, tenants can be assessed late fees if they're late. And typically, the lease will define when rent is considered late. Most leases that I've seen give about 5 days from the first of the month. So if they don't pay the rent by the 5th of the month, then it's late. And so that can have a real impact, because some of your clients may be not getting their monthly check until the 3rd of the month. So that only gives them 2 days to make sure that their rent is paid. So finding out, can they pay online or use an automatic payment method? That can be really useful, for people to just have the rent go automatically from their bank account, or from their, if they have one of those direct payment cards, then they can set up automatic payments. that can be very helpful. And then that way it's kind of taken off the top and taken care of without them having to do a lot of extra steps. If they don't want to do automatic payments, can they mail a check or a money order? Sometimes people think that they can just take it to the office. And many times they can, but sometimes it needs to be mailed to another location. And with the way the mail has been going recently, that can be a complicating factor. And I've had situations with clients where they were dropping, there was a mailbox or drop box for the rent for the office, and they were dropping their rent in there, and then for some reason it wasn't being recorded, and then they had no record because they were using money orders. It's not that they didn't have a record. They had to find and make sure they kept their the little stub that comes with the money order, because they had to go back and try to track it to find out whether or not it had actually been spent. And so they kind of had several months of trying to get that resolved. And then sometimes it's not easy, especially not so much right now, but when we were during lockdown for the pandemic, which nobody expected, but it wasn't always easy to get a check or money order. So, thinking about all that and talking with your clients about that to kind of figure out what works best for them is good to do ahead of time. And yeah, I think I touched on all these other points. Next slide. Okay. Finding out if there are other members in the household. Now, you're probably going to know this since you're working directly with people. And you're going to know ahead of time if they want to add anybody to their household, or if there are already other members of the household involved. The lease will spell out the process generally of when someone can be added to the lease. So in situations where, say, you have a client who ends up getting married to their significant other, and they were living separately, but now they want to live together. So it's good to be able to access the lease to figure out what process do they need to go through, because it usually is a process to make something like that happen. So typically people can be added 1 year after 1 year of residence, but not always. It depends on what the situation is. If you're adding a child to the household, that can, if it's an unexpected situation where someone, gets custody unexpectedly of a child, that may happen prior to them having been there for a year. And so it's important to have documentation on that. Adding adults to the household can have an impact on the income limits for the program, and an impact on how much rent they're going to have to pay. So all of those things need to be considered. You typically adding another adult to the household also requires a criminal background check, similar to what the tenant had to go through when leasing up, and that can have extra fees because the property is probably going to pass that cost on to the tenant. So all of that has to be thought of. And then the tenant, as the head of household, the first person who signed the lease, will be responsible for their household members' behavior. So that is definitely something to emphasize and make sure that your client understands prior to adding someone to the household. Next slide. Okay, so Penny mentioned this briefly, but again, tenants should be aware that they will be contacted about lease renewal at least 60 days prior to the lease end. It can be as much as 120 days, so actually 4 months ahead. But typically it's more around 90 days, 60 to 90 days. And so they need to be aware that they're going to have to provide updated documents, not usually the birth certificate again, but income, statements. Sometimes they have to give utility bills. They may have to give bank statements or anything else that the landlord or property manager requests. So sometimes that can be shocking for tenants, and it can be stressful. And so it's good to let them know ahead of time, hey, just be aware that this is going to happen. That's why, they'll notify you 60 to 90 days ahead of time, so you have time to gather all this information. And that, your client and how much assistance they might need with that. Some people you can say, okay, get this, this, and this, and they can go out and get it themselves. Other people, you may have to break it down for more steps, and you may have to assist them more in terms of making sure that they're able to access those documents. Next slide. Okay. So, I always emphasize when I'm doing tenant training, making sure you know where these documents are, keeping them all in one place, keeping the lease in one place where it's easy to get access to. And then hopefully as the case manager, you can get a copy of a lot of these things, because sometimes it can save time and assistance. You'll have, I'm sure all of you'll have some clients who are super organized, and then you have other clients who, it's like they get some paper and they just kind of throw it in their house somewhere, and who knows where it is because it's in this mound of paper. So trying to encourage keeping important documents organized can save a lot of time and aggravation for everyone involved. Clients can give a copy to a trusted family member or friend if they have trouble, keeping things organized in their space. And of course, I always encourage people to consider obtaining a fireproof safe. You can get one for not too much money, $20, $25 at Walmart or Target. And, keeping important documents in there like birth certificates, the lease, things like that could be make life a little bit easier. Next slide. Okay, this is a true or false. A landlord can change the locks and place a tenant's personal belongings on the street if they don't move out by the notice to vacate date. Is that true or false? And you can put answers in the chat. Oh, there's actually the poll, so you can answer the poll. Sorry. I'm glad the polls are working again. So please answer the poll. And will we, Chelsea, will we be able to see the?
It's actually Christina, Marianne, but hey, so the responses were 45% for true and 55% for false.
Okay, wow, yes. So the majority rules, that is actually false. A landlord cannot change the locks and place a tenant's personal belongings on the street until they get a court order from the court. They have to go to court first. The first step is doing a notice to vacate. Next slide, please. So in terminating the lease, if the tenant wants to terminate the lease, when the lease renewal arrives, so when they get notified by the property manager or the landlord that it's time to renew the lease, then the tenant can choose to give notice that they do not plan to renew. Typically, in a lot of programs, you have to give 60 days notice. If there's a medical emergency or another kind of emergency, maybe you can give less notice than that. But if your tenant knows that they want to leave, and if your tenant, that your client that you're working with wants to leave, then when they receive the lease renewal is a good time to make that notice, because again, they're usually going to get that contact 60 to 90 days before the lease actually ends. And again, the tenant may need to end the lease early due to medical reasons, and they could request to leave early, and hopefully the property manager or landlord will honor that request. But if it's due to medical reasons, but again, looking at the lease to kind of determine what are the parameters that they have set out for ending a lease early. Sometimes it may involve paying extra fees. And again, that could be, the tenant could request like, a reasonable accommodation around that if necessary. Terminating lease by the landlord, they give what's called a notice to vacate. So it has to be a written notice, and it needs to be provided at least 30 days prior to the requested move date. So they may, post something on someone's door or mail it to the tenant saying, we're asking you, we're terminating your lease, or we're not renewing your lease, and we want you to move out by, September 30th. And that could be the start of the eviction process. In Maryland, again, they have to provide this notice prior, but there's also other steps that are involved in that. Next slide, please. Oh, I have another poll. You can stop paying your rent if the landlord hasn't made necessary repairs. Is that true or false? Give people a little time to answer.
So we have 22% said true and 78% said false.
Yes, the 78%, again, majority rules. That is false. If your landlord is not making necessary repairs, the tenant has to go to court to request an escrow account. So they can't just stop paying the rent. They actually have a process that they have to go through with the court. Next slide, please. Okay, so somebody had asked, I did see somebody asking in the chat that saying, I thought the court gave you 60 days, not 30 days. So it's not necessarily a set time, but with the eviction process, it's a legal process. So it starts with the landlord or property manager providing written notice to vacate. Then they can file for eviction in district court. So they have to actually go through a court process. Now, sometimes they may do those things somewhat simultaneously, although I believe, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just gonna preface this, in my experience, if they, for example, if the rent is due on the 1st and they have a grace period until the 5th, and the tenant doesn't pay the rent by the 5th, they could go to court and file after that, what they consider quote unquote non-payment of rent immediately, and still give the written notice to vacate, but then the court process and the written notice to vacate process is happening kind of simultaneously. But they have to file it for eviction in district court. And the reasons that they can file are, again, failure to pay rent, including withholding rent for lack of repairs or other issues with the unit without getting an escrow account. Tenant holding over. So that's when the tenant doesn't move out at the end of the lease, and for breach of lease, violating the terms of the lease. So time-wise, it really depends on how the court is running and when they schedule the hearing. So there has to, once the landlord files in district court, then a hearing date is set, and there's a court notice of eviction, usually for failure to pay rent, but it could be any of these other options. And that has to be notification of that hearing date, and that the landlord has filed, has to be given to the tenant. Sometimes it will be, hung up on the tenant's door. It could potentially be mailed. It could be placed in their mailbox. But it's very important that they attend that hearing. Next slide. Okay, so I just said this, but the tenant should receive an official court summons to attend a hearing. And it is very important to attend the hearing, because if they don't attend the hearing, things could go pretty badly for them. So the summons, again, as I said, can be served in person, it can be mailed, or it can be posted on the rental property, so posted on the unit door. So a judge will hear arguments on the date of the hearing and evidence from both sides, and decide to either rule in favor of the tenant or the landlord, or they could potentially postpone the hearing, giving the parties a chance to resolve the issue. So that's why it's important to go to the hearing, because I have seen tenants go to the hearing and be able to get a postponement because maybe they just needed a little bit more time to pay. Something happened with their income or their paycheck, and so they're waiting to try to get this information. Or they can go in and to the court and say, listen, I've gone to these different agencies and they are going to help me pay the rent, but it's taking a little time for the process to happen. If the tenant doesn't go to the court, the judge doesn't know that, and they most likely will rule in favor of the landlord. If the judge rules in favor of the landlord, then the landlord can file a court order eviction, which is also called a warrant of restitution, within 5 working days of that hearing, and they can schedule with the sheriff's office to oversee the eviction. So I saw somebody in the chat had mentioned, yes, the sheriff is the one who serves that, but again, it's a process. So, and the warrant of restitution, it really depends, time-wise, it really depends on how busy the sheriff's office is and how many warrants of restitution they need to serve. So anytime after that court date that it's ruled in favor of the landlord, there's that 5 days that they have. Next slide. So the tenant can appeal the eviction within 4 days of the date of judgment if it's for non-payment of rent, and within 10 days if it's breach of lease or holding over. So, and the tenant may have to post bond to cover the rent while waiting for the circuit court to decide the appeal. So timeline wise, it really kind of depends on the scheduling with the court, the scheduling with the sheriff's office, whether or not there's an appeal. But it's important that that the tenant be aware of these deadlines, because it could make a difference in them being evicted. So on the date of the eviction, the sheriff usually, again, will notify the tenant will get a copy of the warrant of restitution, which is the request for the actual physical eviction, and it will usually have a date on there. And then on that date, the sheriff will come to the unit to order the tenant and anyone who's still there to leave. And then the landlord, property manager, or their employees can come and remove their property from the unit. And usually it's put on the street. I mean, I think we've all seen, there was something on the news last night. CBS Evening News was following sheriff's office. I think they were in Texas, and they were serving warrants of restitution and knocking on the door and evicting people, putting them and their stuff out on the street. So, and that is like the worst possible outcome. So we want to try to avoid that at all costs, if possible, because it's, it's humiliating for tenants to have the sheriff come and kick them out if they're still in the home, and then have all their stuff on the street. And I've had people who, they had their stuff put out on the street, and as they were trying to find somebody to help them move it, other people in the neighborhood or from around were coming and taking their stuff. So, it's a very unpleasant process. And I do have all this information I got from Maryland Attorney General's website. So that's the web address. So if you want to read up more about this, you certainly can. Next slide. So hopefully the tenant, your client, will let you know immediately if they receive a notice to vacate, so that you can assist them to address the situation. And sometimes you might want to refer them for legal assistance, and we have some resources that will be listed at the end of these slides. If the tenant is in one of our Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing programs, you can contact me because we have a tenant issue process, and I'm the main contact for that. And we'll just help you, kind of think through the situation, case consultation, give you some resources, any resources that I'm aware of that might be able to assist, and even assist to outreach to the property or landlord to see if the issue can be resolved. And you also, if you get notice from your client that they received notice to vacate or a court summons, sometimes people don't want to stay after situations like that. So, you can discuss alternative housing options with them. And I see there's a question from Monica. When a tenant gets a gold letter, how many days do they have to respond? So when the gold letter is the court notice of hearing for failure to pay rent generally. Sometimes it can be pink. So they have to respond by the hearing date on that notice. So, and that can be anywhere, again, from, it depends on what the court's docket is like. So I've seen it be, I've seen people get court dates within a couple of weeks. I've seen people get court dates within a month, but they need to go to that hearing, or if they're able to resolve it prior to the hearing, they can talk, as soon as they get it, they can contact you, or they can contact the landlord and talk with them and kind of try to work something out. But, it really depends on each person's situation, but they have to respond by the hearing date on that notice. Next slide. So community rules. Community rules explain the rules and expectations from the lease, but in greater detail. And community rules apply to the tenant, household members, and any guests that the tenant has. Next slide. So, community rules is really about communication. And one of the big things is, how will the landlord and the property manager reach the tenant? It's important that the tenant keep their phone and email contacts updated. The landlord could contact you by phone, by mail, by letters, or flyers posted on a tenant's door. Sometimes they may see you pass in the office and, call your name. So, it's important to make sure that the tenant is able to respond when they get contacted by the landlord. If the tenant has any issues with landlord, that's where you as a case manager come in. You can, the tenant can request your assistance in order to effectively communicate with the landlord or the property manager. They can also, if they have a close family member or a friend, they can request that they receive copies of all communication, if that would be helpful. That could actually be requested as a reasonable accommodation. And again, there's the tenant issue process. so they, they can contact me as well. And I can assist with contacting, making connections between the property manager, the case manager, and the tenant. Next slide. So, the relationship, Penny touched on this a little bit in her presentation, but relationship with landlords and property manager, neighbors and others, the tenant should be encouraged to always use respectful language and behavior. Sometimes situations can get tense and everybody, has their breaking points, which is why it's good to talk about this stuff ahead of time and maybe even run scenarios with your client about how they might handle different situations that come up. Somebody, if they're in a lower floor apartment and they have somebody over top of their head and they feel like that person is always jumping up and down. And this is a real life example. I had a client that felt like the person above them was deliberately like dropping bowling balls on the floor above their head, just to mess with them. People are not always aware of what they're doing, but so if you have a client that is dealing with a situation like that where there's a lot of noise above them, how are they going to deal with that? Do they have a relationship with the person upstairs, where they could actually talk to them and say something to them? Do they not know this person from Adam? They don't even know what the person looks like. So, then maybe they need to go handle it through the property manager. Maybe there's a process for dealing with situations like that laid out in the lease. So it's always something to discuss. Conflict resolution, knowing what that process is. What is the grievance and appeals process? And again, if what is the relationship with a property manager? Do they have a good relationship with a property manager where they can go and express their concerns and feel like they're being heard and listened to? Or is the relationship with the property manager difficult as well? In which case, maybe they need to seek assistance from their case manager or supports planner or some other formal dispute resolution. Next slide. Again, if there's any problems with dealing with the property manager or the rental office staff, they should be coming to you as their support planner or case manager for assistance. And then if you're having problems dealing with the property manager or landlord, then you can come to me through the tenant issue process for assistance in dealing with that situation. And then the tenant always has the right to seek legal representation. If they feel like they are being discriminated against, or if it feels like, the landlord is trying to do something that, they feel is wrong or illegal, then I always encourage tenants to seek out legal representation. And there are a number of agencies, and we have a slide in a little bit that will talk about where people can get legal help. Next slide. So community rules also address things like smoking policy, and in these new buildings and most of our programs, so the HUD 811, Project Mental Assistance, Weinberg program, there is typically no smoking anywhere on the program properties. And that includes the parking lot, sidewalks that surround the building, all of that. So it's important for the tenant to understand that, because if they smoke, they're going to need to figure out a plan for how they can smoke, not in their apartment and not on the property. If they have guests that smoke, a lot of times maybe the tenant doesn't smoke, but maybe they have guests that come over. They want to make sure that their guest understands what the smoking policy is and where they can and cannot smoke as well, because if they have a guest that is breaking the policy, it could be seen as a lease violation for the tenant, even though they didn't actually do the actual action. They are held responsible for their guest actions. Again, And this is really important because we have had a few instances of this in the HUD 811 program, people wanting to use medical marijuana. It is prohibited on federally assisted properties according to the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998. So, and all of the HUD 811 units are in properties that are federally assisted. So there is no medical marijuana use on those properties. Definitely not smoking. And actually it just says medical marijuana. So that's edibles as well. So it's really important that participants understand, that tenants understand that prior to moving in. And that's a discussion you have. If medical marijuana is a real need of the person, then they need to consider potentially other programs. Next slide. So another important piece of the community rules is the maintenance of the unit. Property manager or the staff might have to enter the unit. They have the right to enter the unit. They have to give notice, but they do have the right to come in and inspect things. And sometimes there might be emergencies, if there's a flood in the unit above the unit, they may need to come into that unit emergently to try to, address or remediate any problems related to that, maintenance emergencies. If they think I've had this happen to a couple of clients where they were cooking and not monitoring the stove closely, and it started smoking. It didn't actually catch on fire, but it was producing a lot of smoke. And neighbors noticed it and they called the fire department, and the fire department came and broke down the door. So those are situations, where staff is going to be entering apartments. Then there are regular maintenance issues. It's important to know when to report these and what the maintenance number is. They could be coming in because of periodic pest control. And usually, again, the tenant will be given notice about that. Sometimes the tenant has to request that before the property comes in. It varies from property to property. I encourage, when I do tenant training, for them to keep a maintenance log, so they know, okay, I requested, I put this maintenance request in on this date. And it's good to have that because then they'll know, okay, this didn't get addressed. I put it in on this date, but it didn't get addressed until this date, or it still hasn't gotten addressed and it's been, 2 weeks. So then they know, and it just gives strength when they're making, when they're following up. Smoke detectors in some buildings, that's something. If there's any issues with the smoke detector, or changing batteries, or it's beeping or something like that, it may be that may be a maintenance request. It may not be something that has to be taken care of by the tenant themselves. And same with light bulbs, depending on the light fixture. If it's a really tall ceilings, that may be something that has to be requested through maintenance, and it's good to know that. HVAC filters, again, that might be something that has to be requested through the office as opposed to taken care of by the tenant. Next slide. I already touched on this a little bit, but tenants are responsible for their guests. There's usually a guest policy of how long people can visit. That's for overnight guests. It's important that the tenant understand that guests must follow all the community rules just as they have to, and that if they don't, it could lead to the tenant receiving a lease violation. And it's important to know what is the length of stay. Does the guest have to register at the property rental office? If they're driving and they bring a car, where can they park? Because in some communities, the parking is only for the tenants, and any guests may have to park on the street, and it might be down the street around the corner. So all of those are things that are important to know. Next slide. Knowing, again, Penny touched on this, but knowing what the trash disposal and recycling policy are. Do certain things have to be taken outside to the dumpster immediately? Is there a trash room on the floor where the person is living? What is the, when is trash picked up? When is recycling picked up? What can be recycled? Some communities you can recycle styrofoam and some you can't. So it's important, all those things are important to know. Knowing what the quiet hours and the noise policy is. Typically, quiet hours that I've seen are usually from 11 p.m. at night till 7 a.m. in the morning. So that's important to know, because both for your client to know so that they're not making noise, but also if they're experiencing their neighbors maybe making noise outside or during the quiet hours, when they make complaints, that could be important, because the complaint is probably going to be taken more seriously if it's happening at 1 a.m. as opposed to 1 p.m. Knowing what the pet policy is and what the exception is for assistance animals. Penny touched on that when she talked about reasonable accommodations. So typically for a pet policy, there's going to be a deposit, and then usually also a monthly fee if it's for a pet. If it's a support animal, a documented support animal, then there usually are no fees associated. What is the policy around supervision of children? Because this could get people in trouble if they have children that are walking around the property unsupervised. If there's a playground, does there have to be an adult there with them, or are they allowed to go out on their own? All of that should be in the community goals. What their move in and move out policy is. Some properties really want you to schedule your move in, because they, especially if it's an elevator building, because they may set aside certain times for moving in, or they may need to put certain wall protections up for that elevator. So it's important to know what that is and to comply with that. And then what are the rules around the use of common areas? What are the hours, if there are specific hours? Again, with children, do they need to be supervised in those areas, or can they go in on their own? Things like that. If you want to rent something or a community room for a party, what are the rules around that? Next slide. Again, knowing what the process is for mailboxes and receiving packages. What are the parking rules? What about automobile maintenance? Some places don't allow washing cars in the parking lot, or even fixing vehicles in the parking lot. So it's important to know what those are, because you don't want to violate over something simple like that. Do they have a policy about storing flammable materials? Many places do, because they don't want you to blow things up. And I forgot to put it in here, but even things like grilling, if you have a balcony, most of these buildings don't allow you to grill within a certain amount of feet of the property. So it's important to know that kind of stuff, because that's the kind of thing that your neighbors can report on you because they can smell it. So it's important. What is the storage policy, and is there a dress code? Some places don't want people coming out of their apartment in their pajamas. There's actually a dress code for some things. We've actually heard complaints about that before. Next slide. Keeping the unit clean, very important. A clear pathway to doors and being able to get around. Many of our clients have a disability, and if they have to call emergency services, we want them to be able to get to them easily. Keeping the unit tidy to limit pests, and going over during tenant training with clients about usually the pest policy and the bed bug policy might be actually separate. Some properties have a special bed bug policy. So it's good to go over that because that's been more of an issue. And it can be quite burdensome. And if they don't meet the requirements of that policy, then it could result in significant expense for them. So that's important to point out and know. A lot of places, there's an annual unit inspection prior to the lease renewal or right around the same time. So it's important that tenants know that, and so they can have their unit in a good situation when they come to do the inspection. And, you know, talk with them about how they're going to get help with cleaning. Are they able to do cleaning on their own, or do they, you know, are they eligible for a personal care assistant who maybe can help them with that? And if not, are they able to pay for housekeeping services if they need help with that? I know that that's, you know, not something that typically our clients are able to do, but it might be necessary, maybe even if it's a one-time thing. You know, it's important to know, and I know things have been difficult because of the pandemic and not necessarily being able to go to people's homes and visit them, but it's a good idea to know, you know, does your client have an issue with cleanliness? Do they have an issue with hoarding? So that you can be aware and be trying to address that. Next slide. Oh, this was another poll question. What temperature does BGE recommend that thermostat be set to in the summer? And I'm just in, oh, okay, here's the, I was gonna say in the essence of time, I'm just gonna answer this question ahead of time. They recommend, BGE recommends that during the summer, the thermostat be set to 78 degrees or higher. And that can, you know, a few degrees can have a significant impact on the person's bill. Next slide. Okay. It's important to go over with people, especially people who maybe never rented before, or maybe they were never the head of household before. They may not know how to use all of the appliances that they have access to now. And also things like thermostats have changed quite a bit. So if it's been a while since somebody has had their own place and had their own thermostat and been able to monitor that, you know, they might need help going over the new thermostat. And if you don't know, then sometimes maintenance can be requested to ask to give people, you know, instructions on how to use that. You know, what temperature should they keep their refrigerator at? You know, letting them know that yes, the oven needs to be cleaned periodically, especially if something gets spilled in it. If they cook a lot and things get spilled, you know, it needs to be cleaned. And if you clean things as periodically as opposed to waiting until you know, right before the unit inspection, that it'll be easier. Do they know how to use the dishwasher? What kind of detergent to use, and do they know that it should be run at least once a month? I didn't know this until a few years ago, that dishwashers need to be run about once a month at least. You know, if somebody's single, they're probably going to be washing dishes by hand more since they're only using, you know, one plate, one cup, one knife, one fork kind of thing. But if they have a dishwasher, they should run it periodically, even if it's just on the rinse cycle. You know, what can go in a garbage disposal? Because sometimes people put things down there that, you know, can really mess it up and may cause an expense for themselves if they break it. So, you know, that there are certain things that shouldn't be put down there. Potato peels, banana peels, bones. You can't assume that people know this stuff. You know, so it's good to have a conversation. If it seems like they do know it, you don't have to linger on it. But if they don't, you know, you can save them against significant pain and expense. Next slide. It's important for the tenant to understand that damage to the unit could be their responsibility. and it could impact their ability to get their security deposit back when they get ready to move. And again, there's some examples of damage to the oven from cleaning because if they didn't use the appropriate cleaning products, damage to the unit door for emergency responders, as I was talking about previously about that client that I had that had a lot of smoke and the fire department came and kicked that door in. That door costs over $500 to replace because it was a special fire retardant door. It wasn't like a regular door, and he had to pay that. And it was a lot of pain. And he very much wished that he had been paying attention to what he was cooking in the oven. Again, damage to walls and floors from wheelchairs. Sometimes, wheelchairs, automatic chairs can do a lot of damage to walls, leave dents and even holes. Definitely skid marks, sometimes from running into it with the wheels. So those are things that, could impact their tenant's ability to get their security deposit back. And lists of repair costs, again, the landlord could come at the tenant toward the end of the lease or when they're getting ready to move out, just kind of list of things that could eat up the security deposit and actually cause them to have extra expense. The owner's responsibility are things like flooding from other apartments or storm damage, fire, or if the property staff damages the unit when performing maintenance. Next slide. And this is just a little flow chart that talks about the tenant issue process. So again, the property manager may identify a potential lease violation, and hopefully the first line of defense is for them to contact the tenant to resolve the issue. But if that fails, then they will probably contact you as the case manager. And then hopefully you'll be able to assist the tenant to resolve the issue, discuss the importance of paying attention to these lease violations and, helping them access services if the lease violation was due to that, or if it was just explaining things if it was due to a misunderstanding. And then if for some reason the property manager can't get in touch with you as a case manager, and again, this is for the HUD 11 program, the Weinberg affordable apartments, and the Money Follows the Person Bridge Subsidy program, and Community Choice Homes, the 4 programs in the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing. Then they may contact me, and then I will try to get in touch with you to see if I can provide any assistance with the communication between the property manager, case manager, and the tenant to resolve the issue. And if they can't get in touch with me, then they will probably contact Christina at MDOD, who's the waitlist manager, and then she will get in touch with me. And the idea here is that we are a team to assist you and provide some technical support around dealing with these issues, because sometimes tenant issues can be quite difficult to manage. Next slide. These are the legal resources I talked about earlier, just some websites and places that provide free or very low cost legal assistance and information about some reasonable accommodations from HUD and the Fair Housing Act, also from HUD. Next slide. And finally, this is all of our contact information. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or about this presentation or about tenant training. We are happy to talk with people. That's part of our job, to assist case managers in dealing with these and hopefully making successful transitions and supporting successful tenancy. And I'm aware we're a little bit over time. So I know we don't really have time for questions, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to contact us at these contact information. And I believe these slides will be sent out after this presentation. And I believe information about how you can access the recording will also be given. Christina? Thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you for joining, everyone. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. We had a couple, and they were a little bit over. There was a lot of people saying thank you in the chat. I just wanted to let everyone know that this was recorded. So the recording will be put up on our YouTube page, and I will send out a link to everyone who attended today. Please make sure, if you have not done so already, to register for the next session on the 1st. That is also at the same time from 10 to 12 p.m. We will have Renita Broadwater and Denise Lopez from the Coordinating Center presenting on emergency preparedness and staying safe in your home. So again, please make sure that you sign up for that session. Look out for my follow-up email. And I will include a link to the slides. And yeah, so thank you everybody for spending your morning with us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks again, everybody.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Chelsea.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.